Georg Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is not exactly the easiest book to understand, and I confess I myself have not read the entire thing. This is a very basic introduction to the study of Hegel and the Phenomenology. Hegel is a 1700s and 1800s German philosopher. He has been extremely influential on post-Kantian philosophy. Very much so in Britain and America, but even more so in the European continent. Hegel is a philosopher of history. He has a very potent philosophy of history. He is known for his idea that human history manifests the development of an all-encompassing mind or spirit that is coming to understand itself. It is a divine mind or spirit that is coming to understand itself, and the story of human history is the story of its coming to understand itself. As a rudimentary way of accessing the idea of Hegel, I would suggest you consider a very old Dilbert cartoon, where Dogbert explains to Dilbert this interesting theory in theology. It's the theory that since small molecules, individually weak molecules, combine to make powerful chemicals, and since small, weak electronic components combine to make powerful computers, God is not our past but our future. Dogbert suggests perhaps God is the consciousness that will emerge when enough of us are connected by the internet. And this is not a particularly, this is not exactly Hegel's theology, but in some respects it is a Hegelian theology. And the idea is that the divine being is to be understood with respect to the end of history, not the beginning. God is the future, not primarily the past, although God is in the past, but God is in process. Hegel is what you could call a developmental pantheist, or a process pantheist. Process theology is any theological system, or any theological theory, or any theological position according to which God is in process. God is growing, God is developing, or God is evolving, God is emerging, perhaps. Process theology has it that God is changing. God, at the end of history, will be more than God was at the beginning, if God was even there at the beginning. Hegel seems to be a process theologian and has been very influential on other process theologians. Now, Hegel's method is famous. It's the method of thesis, antithesis, or synthesis. It's what has been called the dialectical method of Hegel. Now, this method is more than one thing. It is a method by which he studies things, but it is also an understanding of how history works through the resolution of antitheses. So, you have a thesis. A thesis is a position. And you have an antithesis, which is a contrary position. And in a synthesis, you merge them somehow. You find some way of combining both positions, mediating both positions to make a higher position that integrates the two. The method of thesis, antithesis, and resolution of their conflict in synthesis is the Hegelian method. And he'll provide numerous illustrations of this, and I'll get to one interesting illustration of the method as an analysis of history. He provides various illustrations of this in his text, of how a thesis and an antithesis are synthesized. Now, it's important to understand it doesn't stop there. The synthesis is now a new thesis, and it is going to be in conflict or in tension with some new antithesis, and those two, of course, will also be synthesized. And then that will be a new thesis, which will be in conflict with some new antithesis, and the new synthesis of those will be necessary. And this keeps on going for a very long time. And one of the interesting questions in Hegel interpretation is whether it ever actually stops, or whether we eventually reach a final synthesis. if I understand the situation correctly, the question is, do we eventually reach a final synthesis, or do we approach closer and closer to it without ever getting there? Using a geometrical term, do we approach it asymptotically? Now, if we do ever reach the final synthesis will be God in his final form, and this will happen at the end of history, when all is complete. In the meantime, thesis, antithesis, synthesis is both the method for the philosopher who is trying to understand things, but it is also the right way to interpret the events of human history. And Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit will tell us some more about that. This spirit that is coming to understand itself, the divine consciousness that is emerging, itself undergoes the process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in human history. Now, probably the most famous passage in all of Hegel's writings is this text from the Phenomenology of Spirit about the conflict of the master and the slave. And the general idea is that the master is a consciousness, and that consciousness has the position of a thesis. It is a being aware of itself, having its own perspective, its own interests, its own desires. And it is in conflict with another person who is an antithesis, a consciousness opposed to the first consciousness. And the two are in some sort of a struggle. And this consciousness that is opposed to the first consciousness, this antithesis consciousness, the antithetical person, is the slave. You have the master and you have the slave. The master has his identity in himself. The antithetical consciousness, the slave, has his consciousness understood in contrast to the master. And there is a struggle between these two. It's a struggle not only between an individual master and an individual slave, but a struggle between a group of people, a struggle between a class of masters and a class of slaves. And this requires a synthesis. A synthesis is achieved when both conscious persons learn to see themselves as interdependent. At this point, the struggle can cease. A synthesis is achieved when interdependence of the master class and the slave class is realized. Now, at one level, this is a fairly rudimentary concept in political philosophy, where the master comes to understand that he actually depends on the slave. And Hegel has this clever and somewhat challenging to read, at least for most people, analysis of the psychology of it. How the consciousness of the master perceives itself, and how the antithetical consciousness of the slave perceives itself, and how the synthesis is achieved in conscious experience. But it's also a somewhat rudimentary lesson in political philosophy that is here, where that the master realizes he is not independent of the slave. It's such a simple concept that you can find it in a Disney Pixar movie. In A Bug's Life, Flick the ant has a Hegelian moment when he explains to the grasshopper master race that they are dependent on their own slaves, not vice versa. They are actually the weaker species, Flick says, because they cannot subsist without the help of their slaves, the ants. And of course, if the grasshoppers and the ants are wise, they will realize their interdependence, and a synthesized social arrangement will emerge out of this conflict of the grasshoppers and the ants. But the genius of Hegel is not in finding this somewhat interesting concept in political philosophy. The genius of Hegel is found primarily in his analysis of this as a chapter in the history of the development of spirit. The spirit that is coming to understand itself does so, at least in part, through the emergence of this discovery of the interdependence of the master class and the slave class. Now, all of this is important philosophy, important history, important political philosophy, important philosophy of history in itself. But it's also very influential on Karl Marx. Stay tuned.